Okay, so today for descriptive writing, we are going to talk about technique one, which is specific information. So there are four things to help writers learn to write better, and that actually is adding more details or specific information into your writing so that it becomes a little bit more entertaining for the readers to read. This could include just little details or huge details that actually wrap in your writing, and it makes the event so much better than what you originally had in your mind. So the first technique, or the first thing that we're going to talk about, is identify specific activities and behaviors. So something that you can do to jazz up your writing and make it better is by adding those activities and behaviors to whatever you are writing about. So an example of this is if you write, "I see a bear in the woods," and that's it. Well, that leaves the readers with a lot of questions, like, well, what's the bear doing? Is the bear running? Is he sleeping? Or is he attacking a random citizen? There's a lot of questions up in the air. So when you are reading, it's really important to make sure that you add those specific activities so you don't leave the reader clueless on what's actually going on. You could also generalize a certain word. So the bear is busy. Okay, well, if you're going to elaborate, that's a good start. The bear is busy sleeping. Well, that makes it a little bit better because then you're adding in the activities and the behavior using keywords. The next thing that we're going to talk about is name the characters. So when you're writing and you have characters for a book or something, it's super important that you start showing that you're adding those details into your character so the reader can start imagining a picture of the character, the personality, what they look like, things like that. So instead of just saying a little girl, you might say something like, "The little girl was wearing a bright red dress and her laugh was the funniest laugh I've ever heard." Well, that shows many things about the little girl. She dresses kind of fancy and she seems to be pretty funny, and her laugh is kind of the more contagious laugh. So those kind of specific information is important when you're writing to give the reader a sense of, okay, I can imagine this little girl in my head. Now, you can always add the details like hair color, is she mean, is she nice, stuff like that as well, just to help your character develop, and so the readers can just create that true image in their head. The next thing that is important is identifying the setting. So that is actually a very important step, just like the character step, and this is because if you don't identify the setting straight off the bat, you're going to leave the readers very confused, and you might even get confused when you're reading back. Like, what were your headspace when you were writing this? Because most of the time you write in a lot of different spaces, and sometimes you get up and you don't work on it for a little bit, and then you come back and you're like, man, what space or setting was I trying to communicate? What was I writing about? And so if you don't have the setting specific information, then it can leave you really clueless as the reader or even the writer. So excuse me, things that is very important. The example of this is if the writer just writes "in a little town." Okay, so each person's going to get a different image. That's the first negative. So if you're trying to convey, like, you're like, man, I have to describe like my hometown, a little town. I lived in a little town in Oregon. So, but you guys wouldn't know that. So it's important to say, if I was describing my little town, that it had huge trees, forests all around it. There was super old buildings that lined downtown when you walked down the main street, and it had a river next to it when you reached the edge of our little town. Key information is important. So when I describe my little town, I would make sure that it's in Oregon, it's about an hour away from Portland, things like that helps the reader identify. But you also want to include things like weather, time of the day, the date, and even the day of the week. And this just provides the reader with good information. So if you're saying a little town, in a little town, you could do so much with it. In a little town on a dark evening night, or on May 31st, I entered a little town that the sky was so bright and the trees were green and stuff like that. So you can actually a date kind of gives you a timeline of when it was done. The weather, it's always important because if you're trying to set a certain type of mood, the weather kind of plays a really key part into that. So because if you're writing more on the darker side, you need to make sure you add dark features. The clouds are dark, it's lightning, stuff like that to help convey what you're trying to convey. So the other thing is the last attribute, which is important. So this one kind of just helps wrap up all the details. So if you said something like the little boy walk on the beach, okay, that's a good sentence. It gives you pretty much, activities. What's he doing? Well, he's walking. He's on the beach, and it's a little boy. But something that can really help is adding all the sounds, what you're seeing. You want to visualize with the little boy walking on. You want to create that full image, not just that narrow little tunnel. You want to create the bigger tunnel. So things you could do for that is, instead of just saying the little boy walked on the beach, you could add sounds like where the seagulls screaming, where people laughing, where the waves splashing and crashing against the sand. Was it daytime? Was it nighttime? Stuff like that, just to add that last final image so that we can actually create, because through those, I see a little boy walking on the beach, a dog running, the seagulls are flying around. That only helps the reader get more of an idea of what's going on. So specific information can be a big help. Just make sure that it's in not too much. Like Lord of the Rings kind of gives sometimes too much detail. So you need to make sure that it's on a good medium level, not too little, not too much. So sometimes just adding a few words can really help, but sometimes it does require a lot of detail, which is super important too. So knowing your audience is really important as well, because that only that helps you understand, well, if they're little, they're going to need a little bit more details because they probably haven't experienced as much as an older crowd. So knowing your audience is really important when writing specific information inside your writing. So something else is that really important is the descriptive writing checklist. So as a teacher, you could always use this to help kind of guide what we were talking about before, too much or too little. This is more of a checklist for your students to use. Too few, just write too many. What we're doing is we're just making sure that you take all the information that you learned, so you're not doing too much and you're not doing too little, and it helps students kind of gauge how much they should be writing, how much detail they should be providing. If it's too less, well, then you just mark the too few, and we have categories. So choosing vivid descriptive words, including 5 sensory words, which is really important in writing. Kind of when you go to the last attribute, you can use the 5 senses for any of those categories that we talked about to help enhance your writing. Make comparisons, describe emotions, choose strong verbs, and use dialogue. So if you use all of those in your specific information writing, it can really help enhance your writing so students can start to become a stronger writing when it comes to this kind of stuff. This checklist is here to help you, not to take over. It's not meant to, this is the final say that I have. It's more of a guide for the descriptive writing checklist, a guide to help your students kind of understand what the nice balance is between the two. So, if you want to, the boy The boy walked on the beach. Okay, well, that's probably too few descriptive words. It's getting there, but it's not enough. We didn't really use the five senses. Not really comparison. Describing emotion didn't really hit anything. But you could say, well, the boy walked on the blue, scratchy sand. Okay, we're getting there. Still a little bit too few, but it's a thing. So that's kind of how it works, because you just kind of conference with the students and talk about, well, how could you improve this? And then it might take a little bit of time, but over time, using this checklist, they can slowly get to the just right. And if you have someone that goes too many, you would do the same thing. You talk to them and kind of work it out, and eventually this checklist will guide them to understand how many of the words are just right. So that is specific information.